I died a pariah universally despised because the world believed I killed a coworker's unborn child in a reckless car crash. The truth, Brenda staged the whole thing. She needed a scapegoat for her dark secrets, and I was the perfect naive target. But the universe doesn't always let evil win. I closed my eyes in a cold, lonely hospital room, utterly defeated, only to open them staring at my office computer screen. It was May 14th, the day of the ride. This time, I'm not playing the victim. The last thing I remembered was the suffocating smell of bleach and the incessant mocking beep of a heart monitor. My life had ended long before my heart actually stopped beating. It ended the day I became the monster of Afton Street. In my previous life, I was a 26-year-old junior financial analyst at a mid-sized firm in Chicago. I was eager to please a textbook people-pleaser who couldn't say no to a stray dog, let alone a heavily pregnant coworker in distress. Brenda Carmichael knew this. Brenda was a senior account manager, 32, perfectly manicured, and flaunting a 7-month baby bump like it was a crown. When she had approached my desk that fateful Tuesday afternoon, claiming her car had broken down and begging for a ride home because the bus made her nauseous and Uber drivers were creepy, I hadn't hesitated. I grabbed my keys. I thought I was doing a good deed. I didn't know that Brenda's marriage to her wealthy husband, Greg, was hanging by a thread. I didn't know she had secretly miscarried a week prior due to her own illicit drug habit, a fact she was desperately hiding from Greg because a baby was her only guarantee of a massive payout in their impending divorce. She needed an accident. She needed someone to blame for the loss of the child. She needed a tragedy. During that drive, Brenda had suddenly screamed, grabbed the steering wheel, and yanked it hard to the right. We crashed into a concrete barrier. I broke 3 ribs and my collarbone. Brenda emerged with minor scrapes, but immediately began wailing, clutching her stomach, screaming to the gathering crowd that I had been texting that I had been driving like a maniac, and that she couldn't feel her baby kicking. The aftermath was a masterclass in manipulation. Brenda painted herself as the grieving mother and me as the careless, entitled Gen Z girl playing with my phone. The police found no text records, but public opinion didn't care. The lawsuit drained my savings. My fiancé unable to handle the social pariah status, and the death threats left me. I was fired. The stress triggered an autoimmune condition that eventually shut down my organs. I died completely alone with Brenda's fake, tear-streaked face from a daytime talk show playing on the hospital TV. And then I gasped. Air flooded my lungs, crisp and smelling faintly of cheap vanilla air freshener and stale coffee. I blinked, my vision blurring and then snapping sharply into focus. I wasn't in a hospital bed. I was sitting in an ergonomic mesh chair. The bright, sterile glow of fluorescent lights beamed down on me. The hum of the HVAC system and the clatter of keyboards filled my ears. I looked down at my hands. They were unblemished. No IV tracks. No hospital gown. I was wearing my favorite navy blue silk blouse, the one that got ruined with my own blood in the crash. Trembling, I reached for the smartphone sitting next to my keyboard. The screen lit up. Tuesday, May 14th, 3:15 p.m. The breath hitched in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut and opened them again. The date remained the same. The sick, twisting feeling in my gut was replaced by a surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I was back. I had been reborn, thrust back into the exact day my life was stolen from me. I looked around the open plan office. Over by the water cooler stood Sarah, my work best friend, laughing about something on her phone. Down the hall, the glass walls of the HR director's office showed Arthur Pendleton reviewing documents. It was all exactly as it had been. Then my eyes locked onto a figure waddling out of the break room. Brenda. She was wearing a tight emerald green maternity dress that accentuated her belly. Her blonde hair was styled in perfect soft waves. She looked glowing healthy and completely innocent. But knowing what I knew now looking at her was like looking at a venomous snake. I remembered her medical records that were leaked online years after my ruin, the records proving there was no fetal heartbeat, days before our crash. The realization that she had worn that baby bump like a prop, carrying a tragedy inside her, just waiting for the right moment to offload the blame onto me. A cold, hard resolve settled over my heart. The naive, sweet Tiffany, who couldn't say no, was dead. She died in a miserable hospital room. The Tiffany sitting in this chair was a woman who had already survived the worst thing a person could do to her. I glanced at the clock in the corner of my monitor. 3:20 p.m. In exactly 5 minutes, Brenda would walk over to my desk. She would put a perfectly manicured hand on her backside dramatically and set the trap. I took a deep breath, straightened my posture, and opened a blank Excel spreadsheet, pretending to be deeply engrossed in my work. I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to call in sick and flee. I wanted to see the look on her face when the foundation of her malicious plan hit a brick wall. 3:24 p.m. I heard the heavy, purposeful footsteps approaching my cubicle. "Oh, Tiffany, sweetie." The voice was like fingernails on a chalkboard. I kept my eyes fixed on my monitor for 2 agonizingly long seconds before turning my chair to face her. "Yes, Brenda," I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. She was already leaning heavily against the partition of my desk, one hand resting protectively over her belly, the other massaging her lower back. She looked pale, a masterful touch, probably achieved by wiping off her blush in the restroom 5 minutes ago. "I'm so sorry to bother you," Brenda said, her voice trembling with just the right amount of vulnerability. "But I am in a bit of a bind. My Range Rover is making this horrible grinding noise, and I really don't think it's safe to drive. I called Greg, but he's stuck in a board meeting and can't come get me." I stared at her. In my past life, I had immediately jumped up full of sympathy. Now I just watched her perform. "That sounds stressful," I said, flatly. Brenda blinked momentarily, thrown off by my lack of immediate action. She quickly recovered her lower lip, jutting out slightly. "It is, and my back is just killing me today. The baby is resting right on my sciatic nerve. I know you live just a few blocks away from my neighborhood. Would you be an absolute angel and give me a ride home? I'd take an Uber, but honestly, with the news lately, I just don't feel safe getting into a stranger's car in my condition." This was it, the precipice, the exact moment my life had ended and my nightmare had begun. I looked her dead in the eyes. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. "No," I said. The silence that followed was deafening. It was a single monosyllabic word, but in the context of our office culture, and particularly when spoken to a pregnant senior staff member, it was the equivalent of a gunshot. Sarah, who sat in the cubicle adjacent to mine, paused her typing. I could feel her eyes darting over to us. Brenda's fake smile froze. Her hand twitched against her belly. I'm sorry. What did you say?" "I said no, Brenda. I can't give you a ride." I repeated, my voice steady, carrying just enough volume to be heard by the surrounding desks. But, why, Brenda stammered, dropping the sweet victimized act for a fraction of a second. A flash of genuine panic crossed her eyes. She needed me. She needed my specific route home, which passed by the treacherous narrow curves of Afton Street, notorious for its lack of traffic cameras. "I have errands to run after work," I lied smoothly. "It's completely out of my way today. Tiffany, please." Brenda's voice pitched higher, a desperate edge bleeding into it. "I'm pregnant. I'm exhausted. It's just a 20-minute detour for you." "I understand you're uncomfortable, Brenda, but my answer is no," I said, turning back to my keyboard. "If you don't feel safe in a regular Uber, you can order an Uber Black. The drivers are highly vetted professionals. Or you can call a licensed taxi service. I can look up the number for you if you'd like." "I don't want a taxi!" Brenda snapped, her voice suddenly sharp. Several heads popped up from their cubicles. Brenda realized her slip and immediately burst into tears. It was a remarkable transition. One second she was furious, the next, a weeping, helpless mother-to-be. "I just wanted a ride from a friend," she sobbed loudly. "I'm so stressed out, and you're being so incredibly selfish. In my past life, this public shaming would have broken me. I would have caved instantly, apologizing profusely while grabbing my keys. But I just felt a cold amusement. I stood up. I am 5'9", a few inches taller than Brenda. I looked down at her. "Brenda, I am your coworker, not your chauffeur. Your lack of transportation is not my emergency. If you are experiencing a medical crisis, I will gladly call 911 for an ambulance right now. Would you like me to call the paramedics?" I reached for my desk phone. Brenda physically recoiled, her eyes widening in sheer terror. No, ambulances. Then I suggest you order an Uber," I said, quietly, sitting back down. "I have a quarterly report to finish." Brenda stood there for another 10 seconds, her chest heaving. She looked around, realizing that while people were watching, no one was jumping to her defense. I had remained completely professional while she was acting unhinged. "You'll regret this," she hissed under her breath, a venomous whisper meant only for me. "I highly doubt that," I replied without looking at her. She spun on her heel and stormed off toward the break room, abandoning the sciatic nerve limp entirely. The moment Brenda was out of earshot, Sarah wheeled her chair over to the edge of my cubicle. Her eyes were wide as saucers. "Holy crap, Tiffany! Remind me never to get on your bad side," Sarah whispered. "I have never seen anyone talk to the office queen like that. Are you okay? She looked like she wanted to murder you." "I'm perfectly fine," I said, a genuine smile touching my lips for the first time since my rebirth. "I just have zero tolerance for manipulation today." "Well, good for you. She abuses the pregnancy card constantly, but honestly, she seemed really panicked when you said no. Like, weirdly panicked. It's just a ride." "Yeah," I murmured, staring at the empty space where Brenda had just been standing. Weirdly panicked. I knew exactly what Brenda was doing right now. She was frantically searching for Plan B. She needed an accident today. Why today? I racked my brain trying to recall the details of the lawsuit and the leaked documents from my past life. Greg, her husband. He was returning from a week-long business trip to London tomorrow. According to the timeline I had obsessed over during my miserable hospital stay, Greg had demanded a doctor's appointment to check on the baby the moment he got back, because he had found out about her drug use and suspected something was wrong. Brenda had to lose the baby before Greg's plane landed tomorrow morning, and she needed an airtight excuse so she wouldn't lose her prenuptial millions. She needed a car crash, and since I had refused, she had to find someone else whose route home offered a plausible scenario for a violent collision. I couldn't just sit here. I had saved myself, but I couldn't let her ruin someone else's life. What if she targeted Sarah? What if she asked the naive new intern? David, I locked my computer and stood up. Cover for me for a minute, Sarah. I need to stretch my legs. I walked down the main corridor, keeping a low profile. I found Brenda cornering David near the copy machine. David was 22, fresh out of college, and looked terrified. And I just really need someone I trust, Brenda was saying, laying a hand on David's arm. You take Interstate 90 home, right? Interstate 90. High speeds, heavy traffic. A perfect place to grab the wheel and swerve into a concrete divider. Yeah, but I have to go to the gym first, David stammered. Please, David, Brenda begged, her eyes welling up again. I'm having cramps. I just need to get home. If you're having cramps, Brenda, you need a doctor, not an intern's Honda Civic, I said, loudly, stepping out from behind a pillar. Both of them jumped. Brenda whipped around, her face twisting into a mask of pure hatred. Mind your own business, Tiffany. I'm making it my business because you're harassing the junior staff, I said coolly. I turned to David. David Arthur wanted to see you in HR about your 401k enrollment. You should head over there now. David didn't need to be told twice. He shot me a grateful look and bolted down the hallway. Brenda and I were left alone in the alcove. The air crackled with tension. What the hell is your problem today? She snarled, dropping the sweet voice entirely. She stepped closer to me, trying to use her seniority to intimidate me. Do you want to get fired? Because I can make that happen. Go ahead, I challenged, holding my ground. Let's go to Arthur's office right now. We can tell him that you're threatening my job because I won't act as your personal chauffeur. Let's see how that plays out for you. Brenda's jaw clenched. She knew she couldn't risk HR involvement. HR meant paperwork. Paperwork meant inquiries. Inquiries might lead to them calling Greg to pick up his sick wife. You're a miserable, selfish little bitch, Brenda hissed. And you're running out of time, I replied softly, letting the words hang in the air. Brenda froze. Her eyes darted over my face, searching for meaning. Running out of time. I knew it was a risky thing to say, but I wanted to rattle her. I wanted her reckless. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice suddenly breathless. Greg gets home tomorrow, doesn't he? I asked, tilting my head. The color completely drained from Brenda's face. The carefully applied bronzer stood out starkly against her suddenly chalky skin. She took a step back, her hand moving instinctively to protect her stomach, not out of maternal instinct, but out of defensive fear. How do you... She started, but choked on the words. I know a lot of things, Brenda, and I strongly suggest you leave the people in this office out of your mess. Call your husband. Tell him the truth. Without another word, Brenda turned and practically ran toward the elevators. She didn't stop at her desk to grab her purse. She didn't tell anyone she was leaving early. She just hit the down button frantically until the doors opened, stepping inside and disappearing. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. My hands were shaking, but a profound sense of triumph washed over me. I had broken the cycle, but as I walked back to my desk, The reality of the situation set in. Brenda was desperate. An animal backed into a corner is the most dangerous kind. She hadn't given up. She had just been forced to change tactics. She still needed an accident. She still needed a scapegoat. I sat down at my desk and pulled up my browser. I couldn't just wait around to see what she did. I needed to document everything. I opened a new email draft addressed to Arthur Pendleton, the HR director. Subject: urgent concern. Regarding Brenda Carmichael's behavior. Dear Arthur, I am writing to formally document an incident that occurred today at approximately 3:25 p.m. Brenda Carmichael approached my desk and aggressively demanded I drive her home, citing car trouble and medical discomfort. When I declined, she became hostile and publicly berated me. Shortly after, I witnessed her attempting to pressure our intern, David, into driving her on Interstate 90. When I intervened, she threatened my employment. She then abruptly fled the building without notifying her team. Given her claims of medical distress, I am concerned for her well-being, but I also feel harassed. I believe a formal record of this erratic behavior is necessary. I clicked send. It was the ultimate insurance policy. If Brenda tried to claim later that she had asked me for a ride and I had somehow caused an issue, I had a time-stamped document proving I had refused and that she was acting erratically beforehand. But I needed more. I needed absolute proof of her deception so she could never ruin anyone else's life again. I looked at the clock. It was 4 p.m. I had an hour left of work, but I was too wired to sit still. I needed to know where Brenda went. Grabbing my coat, I told Sarah I was taking an early lunch break substitution to run to the pharmacy. I rushed out to the parking garage. My modest Toyota sedan was waiting for me. I slid into the driver's seat, the leather feeling reassuringly familiar. I hadn't been behind the wheel of a car since the crash in my previous life. A momentary wave of PTSD washed over me, the phantom sound of crunching metal and shattering glass, but I pushed it down. I pulled out of the garage and headed towards Brenda's affluent neighborhood. If she was trying to stage an accident on her own, she would need her own car. The Range Rover, she claimed, was making grinding noises. I parked a block away from her sprawling gated McMansion. Sure enough, her pristine white Range Rover was sitting in the driveway, but she wasn't inside it. I sat in my car engine off watching the house. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Just as I was about to give up and head back to the office, a rusted, beat-up black pickup truck pulled up to the curb outside her house. The front door of the mansion opened. Brenda stepped out. She wasn't wearing the emerald green maternity dress anymore. She was wearing baggy sweatpants and an oversized hoodie, a baseball cap pulled low over her face. She looked around nervously before hurrying down the driveway and sliding into the passenger seat of the truck. I squinted, trying to make out the driver. It was a man heavily tattooed, smoking a cigarette. He didn't look like an Uber driver. He looked like trouble. The truck pulled away from the curb. Without hesitation, I started my engine and pulled out behind them, keeping 2 cars between us. Brenda's desperate hunt for a scapegoat hadn't ended at the office. It had just moved underground, and I was going to follow her straight into the dark to expose every single lie. The rusted black pickup truck merged onto the Eisenhower Expressway, moving erratically through the afternoon traffic. I gripped my steering wheel, my knuckles turning white, keeping a careful distance. The acrid smell of exhaust fumes from the semi-truck in front of me filled my cabin, grounding me in the reality of the moment. I was tailing a woman who had, in another timeline, effectively murdered me. We drove for nearly 40 minutes, leaving the polished glass and steel of downtown Chicago for the crumbling infrastructure of the industrial district near Cicero. The roads here were choked with potholes and lined with chain-link fences topped with rusted barbed wire. The truck abruptly signaled and hooked a sharp right into a narrow, debris-filled alleyway behind a boarded-up auto body shop. I didn't follow them in. That would be a dead giveaway. Instead, I parked my sedan on the adjacent street next to a mountain of discarded tires and killed the engine. I grabbed my phone, switched it to silent, and crept out of the car. The air here smelled of ozone-stagnant water and decaying garbage. I moved carefully along the brick wall of the auto shop until I reached the corner of the alley. Peeking around the edge, I had a clear line of sight. The truck was parked with its engine idling a rough, throaty rumble that vibrated against the pavement. The tattooed man had stepped out and was leaning against the rusted hood, lighting a cigarette. He wore a grease-stained mechanic's shirt with the name Donnie stitched over the pocket. Donnie Mercer. He looked like the kind of guy who made a living in the gray areas of the law. The passenger door opened and Brenda climbed down. Even in baggy sweatpants and an oversized hoodie, her movements were tense, rigid, with a panicked energy. She looked entirely out of place in the grim surroundings. I raised my phone and zoomed the camera lens in as far as it would go without losing focus. I hit record. Through the digital viewfinder, I watched Brenda pull a thick, bulging manila envelope from her oversized purse. She shoved it aggressively into Donnie's chest. He took it, weighing it in one calloused hand, a smirk playing on his lips. He didn't even bother to open it and count the bills. It was a substantial amount of cash. They were too far away for me to hear their exact words over the rumble of the truck's engine and the distant roar of the expressway, but their body language painted a crystal-clear picture. Donnie took a drag of his cigarette, pointed to the front bumper of his reinforced heavy-duty truck, and then made a violent smashing motion with his fists. He then pointed directly at Brenda. Brenda nodded frantically. She pointed to her stomach, her face contorting into a theatrical mask of agony, pantomiming a woman in severe medical distress. She then jabbed a finger at her watch, holding up a single finger. One day. She needed it done today. Ice water flooded my veins. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Since I had refused to be her unwitting driver and scapegoat, Brenda was buying a professional accident. She was hiring Donnie Mercer to T-bone her pristine Range Rover, a staged hit and run. The sheer violence of a heavy truck slamming into her luxury SUV would provide the perfect, indisputable cover story for her already lost pregnancy. She could claim a reckless driver fled the scene, leaving her traumatized and grieving. It was a flawless pivot. If I hadn't followed her, she would have gotten away with it. Greg would arrive home tomorrow to a weeping wife in a hospital bed, the victim of a random cruel tragedy. He would never suspect her of deceit. He would never ask for the prior medical records. I zoomed in closer, focusing entirely on the rear of Donnie's truck. Illinois license plate J88-29R. I snapped 3 rapid-fire photos to ensure I had a crystal-clear image of the plate, followed by several wide shots of Brenda standing next to him, the cash in his hand, clearly visible. Donnie tossed his cigarette onto the cracked concrete and crushed it under his heavy steel-toed boot. He gestured for Brenda to get back in the truck. I ducked behind the brick wall, pressing my back against the rough, cold surface, holding my breath. I waited until I heard the heavy clatter of the truck shifting into gear and rolling out the opposite end of the alley. I didn't exhale until the sound faded completely. My hands were trembling, but not from fear. It was the adrenaline of absolute leverage. In my pocket, I held the digital key to Brenda Carmichael's total destruction. I hurried back to my sedan, locked the doors, and immediately uploaded the video and photos to 2 separate secure cloud servers. I wasn't taking any chances. Checking the time, I saw it was 4:45 p.m. I needed to get back to the office. If Brenda was planning a staged collision this evening, she would need her Range Rover, which meant she had to go back to her house. I, on the other hand, needed to establish an ironclad alibi and prepare my next move. The drive back to the financial district felt agonizingly slow, but I forced myself to obey every traffic law. I parked in my assigned spot just after 5:15 p.m. and walked briskly back into the office. The open plan floor was mostly empty, save for a few analysts working late. As I approached my cubicle, Sarah popped her head over the partition. Her face was pale. "Tiffany, where the hell have you been?" she whispered urgently. "Arthur has been looking for you for the last 20 minutes. He looks furious." I set my purse down, keeping my expression entirely neutral. "I told you I went to the pharmacy. What does Arthur want?" "I don't know, but he told me to send you straight to his office the second you walked in," Sarah said, biting her lip. "Did something else happen with Brenda?" "We'll see," I said. I walked down the hall to the HR suite. The heavy glass door to Arthur Pendleton's office was closed. I knocked twice firmly. "Come in," a stern voice called out. I opened the door. Arthur, a balding man in his 50s with a penchant for strictly enforced corporate protocol, sat behind his large oak desk. His face was a thundercloud. "Have a seat, Tiffany," he commanded, gesturing to the chair opposite him. I sat down, folding my hands neatly in my lap. "You wanted to see me, Arthur. I received a highly disturbing phone call 30 minutes ago." Arthur began leaning forward and resting his elbows on the desk. Brenda Carmichael called from her mobile. She claimed that earlier this afternoon you became verbally abusive toward her completely unprovoked. She also alleged that you physically shoved her against a filing cabinet near the copy room before telling her you hoped she lost her baby. I didn't gasp. I didn't widen my eyes. I just stared at him, letting the sheer audacity of the lie hang in the quiet room. She was laying the groundwork. If she was in a severe accident tonight, she wanted to establish that she was already under severe stress caused by a hostile coworker. It was a backup plan to sue the company or me if the hit and run didn't yield the payout she wanted from Greg. "That is a severe accusation, Arthur," I said, evenly. "It is grounds for immediate termination and potential criminal charges." Arthur said, his voice hard. "She said she had to leave work early because she was experiencing severe cramping from the assault and is currently waiting to be seen at the emergency room." The emergency room. Of course. She was building a medical paper trail for tonight's grand finale. "Arthur, did you check your email?" I asked quietly. Arthur frowned momentarily, thrown by the pivot. "I've been dealing with this crisis for the last half hour. I haven't looked at my inbox." "I strongly suggest you look at it right now. I sent you an email at 3:55 p.m. today, documenting Brenda's erratic and harassing behavior toward me and other staff members." I said, my tone unwavering. Arthur hesitated, then turned to his monitor. He clicked his mouse a few times. I watched his eyes scan the screen. The hard line of his jaw slackened slightly. Furthermore, I continued pressing my advantage. The hallway outside the copy room is directly covered by the overhead security camera on the south wall. I request that you pull the footage from 3:30 p.m. to 4 p.m. immediately. You will not see me shove anyone. You will, however, see Brenda cornering David, our intern, and aggressively demanding he drive her home on the interstate. You can also bring David in here right now and ask him exactly what she said to him and who intervened to stop her. Arthur looked away from his screen, staring at me. He was a seasoned HR veteran. He knew the difference between a panicked, guilty employee and one standing on a foundation of solid, verifiable facts. "You're telling me Brenda fabricated this entire assault?" Arthur asked, his voice losing its accusatory edge. "I am telling you to check the cameras, Arthur, and I am telling you to speak with David," I replied. "Brenda is exhibiting highly unstable behavior. She aggressively demanded I act as her chauffeur, and when I refused, she threatened my job. She then attempted to manipulate a junior staff member. When that failed, she fled the building. I have zero interest in her personal life, but I will not allow her to weaponize HR against me." Arthur typed something rapidly into his keyboard, pulling up the security feed interface. He found the timestamp. We sat in silence for 2 minutes as he watched the silent footage on his secondary monitor. I watched the reflection in the glass. He saw me step out from behind the pillar. He saw Brenda's aggressive posture. He saw David flee. He saw Brenda storm off. No shoving. No filing cabinets. Arthur sat back in his chair, running a hand over his face. "All right, the footage corroborates your timeline, Tiffany, not hers." "Thank you," I said calmly. "I suggest you document her false report carefully, Arthur. I have a feeling her erratic behavior is going to escalate." I stood up and walked out of his office without waiting for a dismissal. I had neutralized her attack at work. But the real battle was happening outside these walls. I returned to my desk, packed my bag, and left the building. I didn't go home. I drove to a quiet, upscale coffee shop 3 towns over a place where no one knew me. I ordered a black coffee, sat in the corner booth facing the door, and opened my laptop. It was 6:30 p.m. in Chicago. That meant it was 12:30 a.m. in London. Greg Carmichael would be asleep in his hotel room before his morning flight. I needed to make sure he woke up to a nightmare. I created a secure, anonymous Proton Mail account. I didn't use a VPN. I wanted the IP address tracked to a public Wi-Fi network, severing any digital ties to me. I found Greg's corporate email address easily enough through his venture capital firm's public directory. To gcarmichael@pinnaclehorizon.com. Subject: Urgent, your wife's accident. Tonight, I kept the text brief, cold, and entirely factual. "Mr. Carmichael, you are being manipulated. Your wife Brenda suffered a miscarriage over a week ago due to her own negligence. She has been faking the continuation of the pregnancy. Because you are returning tomorrow and will undoubtedly request a medical checkup, she requires a scapegoat. She initially attempted to force coworkers to drive her home today to stage an accident. When that failed, she hired the man in the attached photographs. His name is Donnie Mercer, and he drives a black F-150, plate number J88-29R. She paid him a large sum of cash this afternoon to intentionally crash into her Range Rover tonight, staging a hit and run to explain the loss of the baby and secure her financial standing in your impending divorce. Do not let her play the victim. Check the timestamp on these photos. Ask for the medical records from before today. I attach the 4 clearest photos, Brenda handing Donnie the thick envelope of cash. Donnie standing next to his recognizable truck, the clear shot of the license plate, and the wide shot of them conferring in the grimy alleyway. I hovered my cursor over the send button. In my past life, I was a victim of circumstances, a passive participant in my own destruction. Pushing this button meant I was taking an active role. I was pulling the pin on a grenade and tossing it directly into Brenda's meticulously constructed life. I thought about the cold hospital room. I thought about the smell of bleach. I clicked send. The email vanished into the ether, hurtling across the Atlantic Ocean, waiting to detonate the moment Greg Carmichael checked his phone. Now all I had to do was wait for the explosion. The rain started around midnight, lashing against the windows of my apartment in heavy rhythmic sheets. I sat in the dark living room, a cooling cup of tea in my hands, listening to the storm. Every time a car drove by its tires, hissing on the wet asphalt, my muscles coiled tight. Somewhere out in that deluge metal was crunching. Glass was shattering. Brenda was orchestrating her masterpiece. I barely slept. When my alarm finally buzzed at 6 a.m., I felt a strange sense of detachment. The paralyzing anxiety that had defined my previous life was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, clinical anticipation. I showered, dressed in a sharp charcoal blazer and matching trousers, and drove to the office. The atmosphere on the floor was distinctly different the moment I stepped off the elevator. Usually, Wednesday mornings hummed with the sound of keyboards and casual chatter about evening television. Today, the air was thick, suffocatingly quiet, punctuated only by hushed, urgent whispers. I walked to my cubicle. Sarah wasn't at her desk. Down the aisle, I saw a cluster of people gathered near the break room. David the intern looked visibly pale. I set my bag down and booted up my computer. A moment later, Sarah rushed over, her eyes wide, clutching a ceramic mug so tightly her knuckles were white. "Tiffany, did you hear?" she breathed, leaning over the partition. She smelled of nervous sweat and cheap vanilla latte. "Hear what?" I asked, keeping my voice steady and my face a blank canvas. "It's Brenda," Sarah whispered, glancing nervously toward the HR suite. "Arthur just sent out an emergency email to the department heads. Brenda was in a horrific car accident last night, a hit and run on the west side. Her SUV was T-boned by a truck that ran a red light." I let a beat of silence pass, ensuring my reaction looked appropriately stunned. Is she okay? She's in the ICU at St. Jude's," Sarah said, her voice dropping an octave heavy with dramatic weight. "She survived mostly cuts and severe bruising, but Tiffany, she lost the baby. The impact was too much." I looked down at my keyboard. It was the exact outcome Brenda had paid for, the perfect tragic alibi. To the rest of the office, it was a devastating twist of fate. To me, it was the sound of a trap snapping shut, not on me, but on her. "That's terrible," I murmured. "It's a nightmare," Sarah agreed, shaking her head. "And to think she was just asking people for a ride home yesterday because she felt unsafe. If only someone had—" Sarah stopped herself, her eyes darting to mine, suddenly realizing what she was implying. "I mean, it's nobody's fault, obviously. It's just random tragedy." "Yes," I said, quietly looking up to meet her gaze. "A completely random tragedy." At 9:30 a.m., the heavy glass doors to the main floor swung open and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Greg Carmichael walked in. I recognized him immediately from the society pages and the brief agonizing court appearances of my past life. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 30s, wearing a bespoke navy suit that screamed venture capital money. His dark hair was perfectly coiffed, but his face was rigid, carved from granite. He didn't look like a man crushed by grief. He didn't look like a father who had just lost his unborn child. He looked like a man walking into a war room. He strode past the reception desk, ignoring the sympathetic gasps of the administrative staff, and headed straight for Arthur Pendleton's office. He didn't knock. He simply opened the door and stepped inside, shutting it firmly behind him. From my vantage point, I had a clear view of Arthur's glass-walled office. I watched the pantomime unfold. Arthur immediately stood up, his face etched with performative sorrow, extending a hand in condolence. Greg ignored the hand. He pulled a slim silver tablet from his leather briefcase and slapped it down on Arthur's desk. Arthur recoiled slightly. He leaned over, looking at the screen. Even from 50 feet away, I could see the color completely drain from the HR director's face. Arthur reached for his desk phone, his hands shaking, but Greg slammed a hand down on the receiver, shaking his head sharply. Greg was giving orders. My heart hammered against my ribs, a triumphant, savage drumbeat. The email. He had seen the anonymous email I sent to his secure corporate account. He had seen the photos of his wife handing a stack of cash to Donnie Mercer in that filthy alleyway. Greg hadn't gone straight from O'Hare Airport to sit by his weeping wife's hospital bed. He had looked at the timestamp of the photos. He had looked at the license plate of the truck that miraculously T-boned her just hours later. He had done the math. 10 minutes later, Greg emerged from the HR office. He didn't look back. He walked down the main aisle, his hard eyes sweeping over the cubicles. When his gaze briefly crossed mine, I held it for a fraction of a second before looking back at my monitors. He marched out of the double doors, leaving a wake of stunned silence behind him. "What was that about?" David whispered, having crept up behind Sarah. He looked like he wanted to execute someone. Before I could answer, Arthur stepped out of his office. He looked 10 years older than he had yesterday. He cleared his throat loudly. "Attention, everyone!" Arthur called out, his voice cracking slightly. The entire floor froze. "I need you all to remain at your desks. We are expecting local law enforcement to arrive shortly. They will be conducting routine interviews regarding Brenda's incident. Please cooperate fully." Routine interviews. I smiled faintly to myself. There was absolutely nothing routine about what was coming. Detective Reynolds smelled like old tobacco and strong peppermint, a sharp contrast to the sterile, filtered air of our corporate conference room. He was a burly man with a thick mustache and eyes that had seen too many liars to tolerate any bullshit. His partner, a younger, sharper-looking woman named Detective Hayes, stood quietly by the window, a notepad in hand. I was the fourth person called in. They had already spoken to Sarah David and Arthur. "Have a seat, Tiffany," Reynolds said, gesturing to the ergonomic chair across the polished mahogany table. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He opened a manila folder, flipping through a few pages of poorly printed notes. "I understand you and Brenda Carmichael didn't exactly see eye to eye yesterday afternoon." Reynolds began looking up at me beneath heavy brows. "Coworkers reported a public dispute regarding a ride home." "It wasn't a dispute, Detective," I replied, smoothly, crossing my legs and folding my hands on the table. Brenda demanded I act as her personal driver because her car was allegedly broken. I declined. She became highly emotional and aggressive. Aggressive enough that you felt the need to file an immediate HR complaint. Reynolds noted, tapping a printed copy of my email to Arthur. Prompt and highly detailed. I value my career here. When a senior staff member threatens my employment because I won't run personal errands for them, I document it. I said, my voice betraying no emotion. Especially when that same staff member immediately attempts to pressure our youngest intern into driving her on the interstate. Hayes looked up from her notepad. Brenda Carmichael gave a statement from her hospital bed this morning. She claims you have a deep-seated vendetta against her. She suggested that because you knew the exact route she ended up taking home, you might have had something to do with the truck that hit her. She implied you hired someone to run her off the road. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. Even backed into a corner caught in her own trap, Brenda was still trying to pull the same maneuver. She was still trying to cast me as the monster of Afton Street. I let out a short, genuine laugh. It was entirely involuntary. Reynolds frowned. You find that funny? I find it tragically predictable, I said, leaning forward slightly. Detective, let me be very clear. I left this building at 5:15 p.m. yesterday. I drove directly to the Roasted Bean coffee shop in Oak Park. I remained there working on my laptop and drinking coffee until 8:45 p.m. I have the digital receipt, and I am certain their security cameras can verify my presence for those 3.5 hours. My vehicle, a gray Toyota sedan, was parked directly in front of their window. I slid a printed copy of my receipt across the table. Reynolds barely glanced at it. I know, Reynolds said, a strange, grim satisfaction creeping into his voice. We already pulled the tape from the coffee shop an hour ago. You were right where you said you were. I blinked, momentarily surprised by their efficiency. Then why are you asking me about her accusations? Because we needed to see how you'd react to them. Detective Hayes spoke up, stepping away from the window. Her gaze was piercing. You see, Tiffany, this isn't a standard hit-and-run investigation anymore. It escalated to a felony conspiracy charge about 3 hours ago. Conspiracy? I echoed, playing the confused civilian perfectly. Reynolds closed the manila folder. Brenda's husband, Greg Carmichael, didn't go to the hospital when his flight landed this morning. He went to his attorney's office. Then he came here to verify a few things with your HR director. Then he came directly to the precinct. Reynolds leaned heavily on the table. Mr. Carmichael received an anonymous email last night containing high-resolution photographs of his wife handing a large sum of cash to a known local mechanic with a lengthy rap sheet. Photographs taken yesterday afternoon directly contradicting Brenda's claim that she went straight home. I kept my face perfectly still, a mask of polite shock. We ran the plates visible in the photos, Hayes continued. They belong to Donald Mercer. We picked Mercer up at his auto shop at 8 a.m. today. We found the black F-150 hidden in a rear garage. The front end was heavily damaged, complete with white paint transfer, matching a 2025 Range Rover. Mercer isn't a stand-up guy, Reynolds added, smirking slightly. The second we showed him the photos of the cash handoff, he folded like a cheap suit. Confessed to the whole thing. Said a rich blonde lady paid him 10 grand in a dark alley to T-bone her car at the intersection of 4th and Elm at exactly 9 p.m. Said she told him it was an insurance scam. An insurance scam, I repeated, letting the words roll around in the quiet room. That's what he thought. But the hospital blood work paints a much darker picture, Reynolds said, his voice dropping. The doctors confirmed she suffered a miscarriage, but the fetal decay indicates it happened well over a week ago, not last night. She staged a violent collision, risking her own life and public safety to cover up a prior medical event. The silence in the conference room was absolute. The phantom smell of bleach from my past life vanished, entirely replaced by the polished, expensive scent of mahogany and justice. "So," Reynolds said, leaning back in his chair, his eyes fixed on me. "Brenda Carmichael is currently under police guard at St. Jude's. The moment she is medically cleared, she will be arrested for insurance fraud, filing a false police report, reckless endangerment, and conspiracy. Her husband has frozen all joint assets and filed for divorce, citing criminal misconduct." "That is a lot to process," I said quietly. "It is," Hayes agreed. She tilted her head, studying me with an intensity that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "What's fascinating to us, Tiffany, is the anonymous photographer. Whoever sent that email to Greg Carmichael knew exactly where Brenda was going yesterday afternoon. They knew enough to follow her, document the crime, and send it to the one person who could dismantle her entire life in a matter of hours." Reynolds tapped his pen against the table. "It was a remarkably precise execution, surgical, the kind of thing someone might do if they knew a trap was being set for them, and they decided to flip the board instead. They suspected me. Of course they did. I was the only person in the office who had openly clashed with Brenda that day. But suspicion wasn't evidence. And the beauty of my digital footprint was its absolute anonymity. I looked Detective Reynolds dead in the eye, my expression open, earnest, and completely unbothered. "Whoever sent that email did Greg Carmichael a massive favor," I said calmly. "It sounds like Brenda is a deeply disturbed, dangerous woman. I'm just grateful I told her no when she asked me to get in that car with her. If I hadn't..." I let my voice trail off, allowing a manufactured shudder to run through my shoulders. I could have been in the driver's seat when that truck hit. Reynolds stared at me for a long, heavy moment. He was searching for a crack, a smirk, a flash of guilt. He found nothing, because I wasn't guilty. I hadn't committed a crime. I had simply turned on the lights in a dark room and let the roaches scatter. "You're very lucky, Tiffany," Reynolds finally said, standing up and grabbing his folder. "A lot of people get pulled down when someone like Brenda Carmichael starts drowning." "I suppose I am," I replied, standing up to meet him. "Is there anything else, detectives?" "No, you're free to go back to work," Hayes said. I walked out of the conference room, my heels clicking sharply against the laminate floor. The office was still buzzing, a hive of shocked whispers and frantic typing. I sat down at my desk, looking at the blank Excel spreadsheet on my monitor. The weight of 2 lifetimes suddenly lifted from my chest. I took a deep, unrestricted breath of the stale office air. It tasted like absolute freedom. The weeks following Brenda's arrest were a slow, agonizing dissolution of the facade she had spent years building. The news cycle in Chicago was relentless. The office saboteur, they called her. The headlines didn't just focus on the insurance fraud. They peeled back the layers of her life, exposing a web of debt-stolen funds from her employer, and the truth about her past miscarriages that she had concealed to keep her leverage over Greg. I watched from the sidelines, a ghost in my own office. My coworkers, once eager to gossip, now treated me with a strange, cautious respect. They didn't know the extent of my involvement, but they knew I had been the one to stand up to the woman who turned out to be a sociopath. I was the person who quite literally had the last word. Arthur Pendleton eventually called me into his office for a formal debriefing. He looked like a man who had weathered a Category 5 hurricane. "The board of directors is conducting a full internal audit," Arthur said, his voice flat. "Everything Brenda touched is being scrutinized. She didn't just orchestrate that accident. She'd been siphoning off accounts for months to cover her gambling debts. She was desperate, Tiffany. You saw it before any of us did." I sat in the chair, hands folded, showing no reaction. I didn't see a criminal, Arthur. I just saw someone who didn't respect boundaries. Arthur nodded slowly. "You were right to stand your ground. I've reviewed the footage again. Your refusal was professional yet firm. I wanted to apologize for how I handled the initial accusation. I let a high-performing senior manager bully me into seeing a narrative that didn't exist." "Apology accepted," I said. It was a lie, of course. I didn't care about his apology. I only cared that I was no longer a victim. The real shift, however, came when I received a hand-delivered letter at my apartment. It was from Greg Carmichael's legal team. It wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. Greg wanted to meet. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met in a quiet, sterile boardroom in the downtown skyscraper where his firm was headquartered. He looked older, the stress of the public scandal etched into the corners of his eyes. "I know it was you," he said, without preamble, gesturing to the chair. "I have no idea what you're talking about," I replied, my voice cool. He didn't press. He simply slid a check across the table, a ridiculous life-changing sum. "Brenda stole from my firm to pay for that mechanic. She used my name to build a life based on lies. When I saw those photos, I realized my entire marriage had been a curated performance. You didn't just save yourself, Tiffany. You saved me from years of a very expensive, very dangerous lie. I didn't do it for you," I said, leaving the check on the table. "I did it for the version of myself that didn't deserve to be a scapegoat." I walked out of that building, leaving the check behind. I didn't want his money. I wanted the silence. I wanted the ability to wake up in the morning without the phantom smell of hospital bleach. As I walked out into the cool Chicago air, I realized the final piece of my puzzle had fallen into place. I wasn't just reborn, I had fundamentally changed. I was no longer the girl who would do anything to keep the peace. I was the woman who understood that sometimes peace only comes after you burn the lies to the ground. 6 months later, the dust had finally settled. Brenda was sentenced to 5 years in state prison. The spectacle of her trial was a brutal public dismantling of her character. She had tried to claim insanity, citing extreme emotional distress caused by the miscarriage, but the evidence of her meticulous planning the alleyway meeting the cash handoff. The staging of the scene was too damning to ignore. I had moved on. I left the firm 3 months after the trial. I didn't need the money, and I certainly didn't need the constant reminders of the life I had almost lost. I pivoted into data security, a field that appealed to my new cautious nature. I liked protecting systems, verifying data, and ensuring that no one could manipulate the truth under my watch. One Saturday afternoon, I was walking through Millennium Park. The city was vibrant, the sun glinting off the bean. I spotted a familiar face near the entrance, Sarah. She looked thinner, more tired, but she smiled when she saw me. "Tiffany, I haven't seen you since the office imploded," she said, hugging me. "I've been busy," I said, smiling back. How's the old place? Empty, she laughed. They're still finding things Brenda messed up. Arthur is practically a shadow of his former self. But you know, it's better. The energy is different. We actually talk to each other now instead of just waiting for her to find a target. I'm glad to hear that, I said. You really changed everything you know, Sarah said, her voice dropping. When you told her no that day, it felt like the whole office breathed for the first time in years. We were all so scared of her, and you just showed us that she was just a person. A mean, pathetic person, but just a person. I looked out at the skyline. She was never a monster, Sarah. She was just a woman who thought she was the main character in a movie where everyone else was an extra. She forgot that we all have our own stories. What's your story now? She asked. I thought about the hospital room. I thought about the car crash. I thought about the girl who was afraid of her own shadow, and the woman who had stared down a sociopath and won. My story, I said, is just starting. I walked away from her, heading toward the train station. I had no dramatic plan, no secret vendetta, no dark past to escape. For the first time in my life, I was just a person walking through a city, living a quiet, unremarkable, and utterly beautiful life. The weight of the past was gone. The cycle was broken. And as I stepped onto the train, I didn't look back. I wasn't running away from anything anymore. I was moving toward everything. That is the end of our Reborn series. Tiffany's journey from a terrified victim to a woman who took back control of her own destiny is one I hope inspires you to stand your ground, no matter who is trying to push you around. If this story touched you, or if you've ever had to overcome a Brenda in your own life, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next epic drama. Stay strong, stay honest, and I'll see you in the next one.